Guys, welcome to another video. You've got Mr. Everything English, and in this video guys, let's change it up a bit. Let's talk about some poetry. Let's talk about the poem London. Now, what do you think of when I say London? You might think of shopping, you might think of restaurants, you might think of work, money, capitalism, you might think of luxury, tourism. London on the surface is seen as a very, very nice place to visit. But this poem explores the other side of London. The side of London that you don't see, you don't normally hear about, you don't normally think about. Because this is a side of London that's almost buried. Now, to understand the poem, you must understand the context of the poem. Now guys, during the time that William Blake wrote this poem, the British Empire was expanding. It was taking over massive parts of the world. There were lots of armies being sent, lots of men were becoming soldiers, and London was the hub. London was the city that was the home of the British Empire. Now in our poem, we have a character, we have a speaker who's walking around London. We assume it's the poet William Blake, who's written in the first person. And as he's walking around London, he's commenting on what he can see. And from there we can infer that this poem does not present London in a positive light. Now, let's go over the poem. Let's read first. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlots curse, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plague the marriage hearse. Let's look at the form first. This poem, guys, I would argue is a narrative poem. A narrative poem is a poem that tells a story. Now, what does this poem tell the story of? It tells the story of our speaker's experience of traveling through London. Now, the overall poem is an extremely negative poem. However, if we look at the structure of the poem, it has a very consistent structure where each stanza has 4 lines. There are 4 stanzas, and it follows a clear A, B rhyme scheme throughout. Now, why is that important? Because that gives it a very positive tone, because there's consistent rhyme, there's no irregularity. However, the content goes against the structure. Looking at the poem on the page, looks nice and clean, nice and neat. You would think it's quite a positive poem, but as you begin to explore it, you realize it is super negative. And that is exactly what the poem tells us about London. Just the way the poem looks nice and clean on the outside, London looks nice and clean on the outside. But the moment you begin digging and exploring, you realize that London is not as happy and positive as we thought. Just the way the poem is not as happy and jolly as we thought. Now let's begin. I wander, first person, and then we have the verb wander. Now wander is almost when you walk around aimlessly. You're just going for a wander. You're just going for a walk. And it therefore starts off, guys, in somewhat of a positive tone, but that positive tone dies in about a couple of words' time. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. Guys, make a note. If something is chartered, it is controlled. If something is chartered, it is controlled and regulated. Now, what's being regulated? Chartered street and chartered Thames. The roads are being controlled by who? The government. But the Thames is much more important. The Thames is a river. Now, rivers are normally controlled by nature, are normally controlled by God. But it's saying here that even in London, the river is controlled by the government. And what is it controlled for? Commerce, business. any opportunity, people are looking to exploit whatever can be exploited in London. Therefore, the first two lines of the poem give us an image of London as a whole. And what's this image? That there's no freedom. Everything is controlled. Everything is sitting on you. You can't even move an inch. And what's the effect of this control? What's the effect of this lack of freedom? I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. And what happens as he wanders through these controlled areas? He marks, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. All right, guys, first things first. The word every has been said here and it's repeated throughout. Now, the idea of every is a hyperbole, it's over the top, but it's giving the impression that nobody is safe from the disease, which is London. Nobody can escape. Now, what does he notice on every person? They've got marks. Now, have they got a physical mark on their face? No. It's a mark of weakness and a mark of woe. Now, I can relate to this a little bit. Guys, I remember when I used to go to university, I used to use the tubes in London a lot. And the people on the tubes in general, not everyone, but the people in general used to be very, very kind of depressing looking, serious looking, no hello, no smile. Everyone's kind of got their own little focus. Now, I'm not saying it's bad or wrong. I'm just saying that they were oozing a particular aura. You can tell they're not happy. And that's the kind of marks he's seeing. What's he seeing? He sees in their face marks of weakness and marks of woe. Woe is when you're sad, but sad because you're in pain. So, guys, the overall image is this. He's saying, I'm walking around London and I can see people that look absolutely destroyed, absolutely upset. Why? Because they're being controlled and they don't even know it. In every cry of every man is juxtaposition, because men stereotypically are not supposed to cry. In every infant's cry of fear, infants cry, but not because they're afraid. Infants cry because they're hungry. They cry because someone's taken their toy, but not because they're afraid. In every voice. Guys, you want to make the first 2 points, the juxtaposition of every cry of every man and every infant's cry of fear. Juxtaposition are two opposite ideas. And it's the idea that London has caused people to behave how they are not supposed to behave. People are upset. People are so super down. In every voice, what does he hear? The mind-forged manacles I hear. What are manacles? Manacles, guys, are like the old school chains that you would see in prisons, where prisoners will get tied on their arms and their feet. Now, where are these manacles? They're in the mind. They're in the mind. Two important things. Number one, he says that as I'm walking, now guys, obviously it's a metaphor. He can't literally hear their manacles. But he's saying that I can almost, as a metaphor, I can hear their chains rattling because they're under so much control. Here's the important part. If he can hear their chains, he's implying that he's not in control. But he said every, so every surely includes him. The second argument could be that he's not noticing their chains, he's hearing his own chains. Because what's the power of control? The biggest type of control, guys, is controlling somebody, but they don't even know they're being controlled. And that is what he's talking about. These people that he's seeing, they look as though they are being controlled. They look as though they are suffering. However, it looks like they're not in control because they haven't realized because of why. Their manacles are not on their hands. Their manacles are in their mind. They can't see the chains that have been put on them. If somebody puts handcuffs on my arms, I'm going to try to break out because I can see the fact they're physically controlling me. But in this poem, it's not a physical control. It's a control up here. These people believe they're free, but the manacles are in their mind. Now, what's a modern day example of this? A modern day example, guys, could be stuff like social media, where because social media, people do things and act in a particular way not because they want to, but because that's what they think they should be doing. So maybe the clothes they wear, maybe the music they listen to, maybe the way they behave, it's because that's how they believe they should be behaving. You could look at debt. A lot of people believe they're free, but they have to work all the time, not to be free, but to pay off their mortgage and to pay off their credit card debt. So it's the point that you live life thinking you're free, but you are controlled so much that you can't even see it. Now that's the first two stanzas. It builds an image that, guys, London is not the place to be. London sounds super depressing. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. Blackening church is an oxymoron because you don't normally associate black with a church. A church is normally associated as being white, as being pure, as being free. Every blackening church appalls. Now, a chimney sweeper, guys, this is talking now about the child labor, the child exploitation that would take place in London. Back in this time, guys, young boys who were like 8, 9 years old had small bones, and they were sent up the chimneys to clean the chimneys. Now, in this time, chimneys were used a lot, and therefore these children were getting ill, and because they were getting ill, they were dying, but nobody cared. Now, why does the writer say that the church is ignoring this? Because the church played much more of a role in society in this time period than it does today. Therefore, by the church ignoring this, it's the idea that it was selective outrage. Religion is not fulfilling its purpose. So on one hand, the speaker is blaming religion because the religious people are not upholding their responsibility. On the other hand, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Hapless soldier, the word hapless means useless. Useless soldier is an oxymoron because we don't normally associate soldiers as being useless. Runs, their blood runs. Now earlier, guys, for your context, I spoke about the British Empire and how the British Empire was expanding at this time. And the hapless soldiers sigh, because the British Empire is expanding, soldiers are being killed because the soldiers are useless. They're not trained fighters. They're not warriors. They're young men, even kids who've been sent to fight for their country. And what's happening, guys? We see personification. Their blood personification, guys, is when you give a non-human human features. Their blood isn't trickling down the palace walls, isn't sliding down. Their blood is running, it's gushing down the walls. Now, what's the point here? Who lives behind the palaces? It's the kings and the queens, it's the monarchs. So on one hand, and these were the people that ruled. So on one hand, the writer is blaming religion. On the other hand, he is blaming the rulers. That you are the cause of the suffering in London. But does anyone here? No, nobody cares. Now look at the first 4 words of stanza number 3. It spells out hair, H-E-A-R. But the hair is hidden. The writer is trying to show us that just the way you can't find the hair, no one is hearing their pleas. No one is hearing their call. Because London, the people of London, have been abandoned by religion and by their rulers. Because what do they care about? They care about their own benefit. They care about their own profit. And therefore, if the kings and the queens and the rulers stopped the wars, this would not allow the empire to expand. Now, let's move on to the last stanza. But most. We have a superlative here. The writer is saying that even though all this is really bad, let me tell you what's the worst. But most, through midnight streets at nighttime, what can I hear? I hear the youthful harlot's curse. In stanza 3, the writer spoke about child abuse when it came to the boys. Stanza 4 is child abuse when it comes to the young girls. A harlot, guys, is a prostitute. The youthful harlot is an oxymoron because prostitutes are not normally young. Now, what's the writer saying here? That in London, poverty was so high, abuse was so high, that young girls, 10, 11, 12, 13, had to become prostitutes to survive. because there was nothing else they can do or they could do. Now this becomes a curse. What's a curse? A curse is like it gets passed on. It's a bad omen that gets passed on from generation to generation and to generation. Living in London, guys, if you were poor, it was a vicious cycle. Because what was happening? The young prostitutes would get pregnant and they would have children. And then their children would raise and grow up to do the same thing because London had no opportunities. And the last line, guys, all this curse, all this negativity, it blights with plague the marriage hearse. A hearse is a car that is used for a funeral, not for a wedding. But it's the idea, guys, that there's no joy, there's no happiness in London. Everyone is suffering, everyone is depressed. Now, therefore, guys, if we're looking at how this poem presents conflict, it's the idea that conflict is shown as being hidden. These people spend so much time being in conflict with themselves that they forget about who is oppressing them. And that's what comes in the first two lines. The one who's oppressing them are those who are chartering the streets, who are chartering the Thames. And who is this? These are the kings and queens that live behind the palaces. And these are the religious people who use religion as a whip to control the people. That's how conflict is shown. How is power shown? Guys, the people are powerless because they're being controlled. And the irony is, the manacles are in their mind. They can't even see it. They can't even see they're being controlled. Because just like hypnotism, just like mind control, you're controlled, but you have no clue you're controlled. And this is how London presents control and power. And that is that, guys. That is the poem, London Broken Down.